The Dakota War of 1862. When American settlers wanted to expand west, they kept on getting into fights with the Native Americans. The American settlers were still claiming lands and killing off their food source. They still had a newly founded government that had no clear picture of what was happening in the West. The United States government, including President Abraham Lincoln, couldn't control such a large area of land while also trying to stop the start of a civil war. President Abraham Lincoln said, "If we get through this war, and I live, this Indian system shall be reformed." When the government grew tired of the ongoing raids in the northern plains, they decided to send messengers in 1851 to talk about a trade with the government that included giving the Native Americans gifts, such as food, guns, and blankets, for the trade of some of their land. The messengers then had many debates with the Native Americans, and over the next year, they ended up having over 375 treaties with the Dakota Nation, founded by the U.S. Department of State, including one of the most famous ones, the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851. Many of these treaties were broken, and the government fell behind on their promise to give the Native Americans food, and the Dakota people were on the verge of starvation. On August 17, 1862, 4 Dakota hunters killed 5 American settlers in Actor Township, Meeker County. These 4 Dakota soldiers consist of Brown Wing, Breaking Out, Killing Ghost, and Runs Against Something When Crawling. Little did the Dakota know that this would lead to over 90 Dakota soldiers and over 600 American settlers dead. And with this, it was the start of a war. The next day, on August 18th, Minnewacanton warriors opened fire on American military at Fort Ridgely. Dakota warriors, along with their chief, Little Crow, attacked isolated farms and settlements in Renville and Brown County. In all, more than 250 settlers were killed in these raids, and 200 women, children, and other civilians were taken as hostages. On August 20th through the 22nd, the Dakota attacked Fort Ridgely, and then turned around and attacked the Sheik settlement, and the women and children were taken as hostages. Dakota then made 2 attacks on New Elm, but the town was evacuated and its citizens fled to Mankato. On August 20th, Governor Ramsey Colonel Henry Sibley. Colonel Sibley led over 1,400 of his soldiers from St. Peter all the way to Fort Snelling. After settling at Fort Ridgely on August 28th, Sibley focused on the training of his troops and future battles with the Dakota. Sibley then set out burial parties to locate and bury the remains of civilians that were killed in the Dakota attacks. On September 2nd, 1862, the burial party was attacked by Dakota soldiers at Birch Coulee. When reports of the attack arrived at Fort Ridgely, Colonel Sibley left for the fighting with the remainder of his military force. The Dakota then withdrew from the battle, and Sibley and his troops returned to Fort Ridgely to continue their training. When Colonel Henry Sibley learned that the Dakota held over 250 hostages, he immediately headed for the Minnesota River Valley. Then, on September 23, 1862, Sibley and Little Crow debated about peace, but Little Crow did not agree to stop the fighting. The next morning, several soldiers from the newly arrived 3rd Minnesota Infantry left camp to forage for food and stumbled upon a group of Dakota soldiers who had been preparing to attack Sibley's forces. Sibley and his troops then went to war for the last time and defeated a Dakota force led by Little Crow at Wood Lake near the Yellow Medicine River. The surrender of the Dakota on September 26, 1862, led many of the Dakota combats to move westward into the Dakota Territory. While most of the Dakota fled to Canada, some of the Dakota men who had fought in the war stayed with their families because they could not move swiftly enough to escape. Numerous Dakota who had not participated in the war, as well as some who had, met Sibley's army at a place that came to be called Camp Release, close to modern-day Montevideo, Minnesota. The Dakota arrived, Sibley took the Dakota into the custody of the U.S. military, and with that, the second phase of the Dakota War began. President Abraham Lincoln federalized the state's militia and put the troops under the command of General John Pope. There, he busied himself sending telegrams to Washington. He asked for additional troops and urged the extermination of what he called the wild beasts. On September 28, 1862, 2 days after the surrender at Camp Release, Colonel Sibley appointed a 5-member military commission to begin accusing Dakota men and mixed blood of participating in the war. The first order of business was to identify witnesses and potential defendants. Reverend Stephen Riggs, who served as a chaplain for Sibley's military expedition, served as a one-man grand jury during the trials. As weeks passed, cases were handled with increasing speed, some lasting less than 5 minutes. On November 5th, the commission completed its work. 392 prisoners were tried, 303 were sentenced to death, and 16 were given prison terms. Reverend Riggs gathered much of the evidence and produced many of the witnesses. President Lincoln and the government lawyers then reviewed the trial transcripts of all 303 men who were sentenced to death. President Lincoln then sent a letter to General Pope and Colonel Sibley saying, "Anxious to not act with so much clemency as to encourage another outbreak on one hand, nor with so much severity as to be real cruelty on the other, I order a careful examination of the records to be made, in view of first ordering that execution as such should be proven guilty of violating females." Only 2 men were found guilty of rape. He then made his final decision and forwarded a list of the 38 names to Colonel Sibley. "The horrible massacre of women and children and outrageous abuse of female prisoners call for punishment beyond human power to inflict. There will be no peace in this region by virtue of treaty and Indian faith. It is in my purpose utterly to exterminate the Sioux, if I have the power to do so, and even if it requires a campaign lasting the whole of next year. Destroy everything belonging to them, and force them out of the plains, unless, as I suggested, you can capture them. They are to be treated as maniacs or wild beasts, and by no means as people with whom treaties or compromises can be made." A letter from General John Pope to Colonel Sibley. General Pope ordered that the convicted Dakota be moved to Mankato and the Dakota non-combats be moved to Fort Snelling. The Dakota who traveled to Fort Snelling beginning November 7, 1862, numbered 1,658. The vast majority were children, women, and elderly. From the early November to December, 5 concentration camps were built from Fort Snelling, Minnesota to Davenport, Iowa. On December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota men were hung at Mankato, Minnesota. At exactly 10 a.m. on a foggy, numbing, chilling December day, 38 Dakota prisoners were being led to their execution. An estimate of over 4,000 spectators came to watch this horrific event, all crammed on the streets of Mankato and the land surrounding it. As the Dakota men took their assigned places for the hanging, they sang a Dakota song as white bags were being pulled over their faces. American settlers played drum beats that meant the start of the execution. The Dakota men grasped each other's hands because they knew they only had seconds left, and at the stop of the drum beat, they'd be dead. With a single blow from an axe, the rope that held the platform was cut. Captain William Dooley, who had lost several members of his family in the attack on the Lake Sheik settlement, had cut the rope. After dangling in the ropes around their heads for almost a half hour, so all the 4,000 citizens would come and see the Dakota men up close, their bodies were cut down and hauled to the shallow mass grave on the sandbar between Mankato's main street and the Minnesota River. Following the mass execution on December 26, it was discovered that 2 men were mistakenly hanged, one named Firstborn Son, and the other named Wasakan, who was a young Caucasian man and was adopted by the Dakota at an early age. These men were simply casualties of war who suffered the consequences. This gloomy day would be an end to this battle, with the start of a war that would last for all of time. Being on camp with no food and with the winter of 1862 around the corner, the rest of the Dakotas suffered greatly. The Dakota women and children were sent to concentration camps where they were constantly worried about their loved ones. They wrote letters to their loved ones hoping that they were still alive. In April of 1863, Congress made a law for the forcible removal from Minnesota of all the Dakota. Most Dakota, after suffering through a harsh Minnesota winter at Fort Snelling, were moved to the Dakota Territory. On March 22, 1866, President Andrew Johnston ordered the release of the 177 surviving Dakota prisoners from the concentration camps. They were moved to the Santee Reservation in Nebraska. The Sioux War went on for many years. In 1890, at Wounded Knee, the generation of warfare that began at Actor Township, Minnesota, came to